I'm confused. This is a Metroidvania made by horror game developers? How does that work? Wait, wasn't I just here? Okay, so I guess I have to play Sekiro now. I'm in that weird subcategory of people who didn't like Dark Souls, getting killed by skeletons, getting killed by undead, barely making it out of the open area. I didn't have fun and I didn't want to come back, and so I didn't play Dark Souls 2 or 3 or Elden Ring. And since I heard Sekiro was one of the hardest of them all, I didn't play that either. So sure, Dark Souls was too hard for me, I couldn't get good, I don't want to play no more. But then I kind of thought about it and I realized something. While I have my limits, as do we all, I've never shied away from high difficulty in games. Especially not so early in a game. Done right, a difficult enemy is really just a puzzle requiring quick button presses, so why did I bounce off Dark Souls? Well, I thought about it and I realized something. I don't like being slow. Dark Souls is a very methodical game. You cannot rush it. You can't go all out. You are limited by your attack animations and your encumbrance, and these are limitations I had a hard time dealing with. I did beat Salt and Sanctuary, but I didn't have nearly as much fun with that as I did with Blasphemous, a game which was equally difficult but did not include a stamina bar. Now that I understand this aspect of myself better, I might actually go back and see if I can approach Dark Souls with a different mindset. Or I might just play Dicey Dungeons again. We'll see how the rest of June plays out. But to finish that train of thought, Sekiro is the odd child from the FromSoft line, not counting the adventures of Cookie and Cream. Because Sekiro, is his name Sekiro? I don't actually know. Is a mightily quick character who requires quicker reflexes. Combat is based far less on dodges and blocks and more on learning an enemy's patterns to find openings which can be exploited. And honestly, that is a more engaging style of play. For me. So when I heard about an upcoming game that looked to honor the Sekiro legacy through similar combat but in a Metroidvania format, I knew there was only one missing element to get me in. Did it have a small, cute, or angry protagonist? I'm in. So what's going on here? Well, I hope you don't mind some light spoilers. We're this fuzzy little dude. Our name's Yi. At the start, Yi is having a rough time being killed and left for dead by someone. An uncertain amount of time later, Yi is brought back through the power of tentacles. He befriends a human child in an idyllic human village in New Kunlun. A village that is not quite what it seems to be. Now if you're confused, then you clearly didn't play the demo. Nine Souls is not the kind of game that puts all its cards on the table from the start. If you want the rest of the story, including the backstory, you're going to have to earn it. Which really makes dialogue so much more natural. Why would anyone labor at length about a past that everyone is already familiar with? Do you just randomly talk to your friends about the founding years of Kroger's? Of course not. Some of the narrative is indeed revealed by the game's characters, but in its own time, when it makes sense. The rest you'll have to piece together on your own from side comments, item descriptions, or background art. And speaking of, the art and world building in this game are absolutely beautiful. The developers describe this as Taopunk, which is nature's way of saying that regular punk no longer has any meaning. You know that quote from Arthur C. Clarke, "Any science sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic"? That rule applies, to the point where this culture, known as the Solarians, treat their technology with an almost spiritual reverence. Despite being a grounded individual who detests superstition, Yi still refers to his attack method as spells. Inscribed slips used for mind control are called charms. Even interacting with Solarian technology has a ritualistic feel, and the more of it we see, the more we understand just what it might mean to be a civilization this advanced. Their technology isn't just indistinguishable from magic, it's indistinguishable from art. As a result, Solarian architecture is built with beauty in mind. Locations are festooned with murals, statues, plaques, and a style which blends Art Deco with Chinese influences. Even the most functional machines are gifted with personality by a society for whom the form is just as important as the function. Now there's been some mixed reception to the game's music. The background music for the Ape Man facility drew the most ire since at times it sounds like someone is gargling. I agree that these are not jams. However, the music in Nine Souls is perfectly fitted to its locations. That facility is a very unsettling place whose implications are bad. Very bad. And a stark contrast from the peaceful feel of the starting area, Peach Blossom Village, so I think it fits perfectly. And I also suspect a number of these pieces involve influences that are inspired by the Taopunk aesthetic Red Candle Games is going for. Though whether this artistic style is actually reflective of Taoism, I'm not entirely sure. There is in-game artwork which resembles examples I found online, assuming AI wasn't giving me false positives, but the game world itself feels more like a blend of science fiction with a variety of symbols and influences of Asian origin rather than being distinctly Tao. But of course that's the opinion of a white guy who grew up in New England and whose experience with Asian culture is heavily mediated by Crunchyroll versus a team of developers actually from Taiwan. But no matter how you slice it, Nine Souls is one damn good looking game and one that needs more fan art. No, not that kind. Whether you like the art or not, you have to give a boatload of credit for the level design. Some of you Metroidvania purists might have just gotten your hackles up by the word levels, and I'm with you there, but hang on. There's been a bit of discourse saying Nine Souls is the next Hollow Knight, or that players are no longer waiting for Silksong because we have this game. I staunchly disagree. Hollow Knight is a much better Metroidvania game than Nine Souls is. Why? Because while video game genres are a messy pile of mixed definitions, one thing that the best Metroidvanias bring to the table is exploration. Spend enough time in any good Metroidvania and you will learn its ins and outs to the point where it practically becomes home. No game to date does this better than Hollow Knight. That said, I liked Nine Souls better. Hear me out! I'm a big story guy. I love narratives, I love characters. The knight has no character, he's a blank slate. That's literally the point of his existence, to be a blank slate. And what we get from everyone else are just bits and pieces. Think about the bosses, how many of them have anything to say while not being Hornet? It's a short list. I don't mind putting the pieces of a story together, but that approach has limitations and requires gaps to be filled by the player's own suppositions. Games that follow the Dark Souls formula have so many lore videos because those answers are often not just hard to find, but absent entirely. And that bothers me. What was I talking about again? Right, level design. So, Nine Souls is pretty good at replicating the feel of exploration, but given enough time, you'll realize that exploration was kind of an illusion. That isn't the same as it being bad, though. Rather than play the long game, expecting players to return to an area over and over in pursuit of treasures, lore, or just the shop, Nine Souls goes all in on your first time. And it does a remarkable job in giving each level its own personality with cool external mechanics to work around. I'm gonna spoil this one. This is the greenhouse. Yes, that's a fish, let it go. So the greenhouse is this big toxic pit where the food of New Kunlun is grown. That yellow stuff is exactly what it looks like. Huh, another 2 nickels moment. But the gimmick of the greenhouse is that everything is volatile and has a bad habit of exploding. And these explosions are a unique damage source. Like a lot of Souls-adjacent games, Nine Souls damage comes in multiple forms which require different ways of dealing with them. But these explosives are undealable. If you are in range, you get hurt. And at first, this is frustrating as heck, particularly when facing this guy. But he taught me something important. Those explosions, they affect the enemies too. This ground is unsafe for everyone. So okay, no deflecting explosions. But what about deflecting explosives? Well, will you look at that? Hey, what if we start a chain reaction? Well, look at that! The greenhouse can be a miserable experience when you first enter it, but just like how you get better at dealing with enemies, you get better at dealing with your environments. You learn their strengths, their weaknesses, and you figure out how to navigate them safely and then fluently. All the levels have something like this. They might add a ton of verticality, they might have enemies that hunt by sound, they might incinerate everything outside of a 5-foot radius of safety. These levels have personality, and it's not just in their appearance, it's in their actions. And as you listen to this, the word linear design might be floating around, and I'm going to agree with you in part. Traversing New Kunlun is a very linear thing. The only time you really have a choice about where to go next is with the final 2 bosses, by which point you've gotten all the mobility upgrades, so there are very few obstacles you can't overcome. But while this is a more linear game, it would have lost something by foregoing the persistent world and sticking with a level-by-level structure. Namely, the same story couldn't be told. This is, after all, a narrative primarily about revenge with a secondary focus on justice and a tertiary one about how cats are cute. These points need a structure from which to be delivered, especially with so much focus on character. The main bosses, the souls, are not just random bad guys. And like their levels, the bosses of Nine Souls bring their own external mechanics to the fight. They aren't testing level mechanics like you'd expect. Instead, each battle is going to be emblematic of their philosophies, martial capabilities, and states of mind. These are complicated figures driven by unique motivations, and the linear structure of the game heavily supports that. It allows for foreshadowing, for twists that span the whole of the narrative and couldn't be implemented if the route was completely up to the player. Whether this bothers you or not will largely depend on how tied you are to non-linear gameplay. Personally, I became so invested in the story that I didn't even notice until I reached the endgame. And speaking of, it's time to go into the spoiler section, so I can go into every nitty-gritty detail, sparing no plot point for the spoiler sensitive, so make sure you go to this timestamp if you want to avoid getting completely spoiled. Okay, are they gone? Yeah, I was just kidding. I'm not going to go into detail on everything because there would be way too much to go into. What I want to use this spoiler section for is to discuss a disagreement I have with Nine Souls. Something I looked askance at, and to do that, I have to spoil the ending. Or at least part of it. Like many games nowadays, Nine Souls has multiple endings. 2, to be sure. The game never labels them such, but the community is already referring to them as the true and bad endings respectively. So, what exactly is New Kunlun? To sum up a very complex narrative, New Kunlun is a kind of arc. Yi's people, the Solarians, have all been infected by a virus called the Tianhua, which, if you Google it, will give you about 800 hits on a dragon horse from them's fightin' herds. I'm partial to this fan art myself. Unable to find a cure in the immediate, the Souls, the ruling body of New Kunlun, hatched a plan to put all their people in stasis with their minds in virtual reality, the scientists infrequently waking up to continue working on a cure. This buys their civilization time. The concept, known as the Eternal Cauldron Project, was Yi's masterwork. But due to a betrayal before launch, Yi was receiving tentacular medical care when he should have been managing his part of the project. Now, 500 years later, the project is in shambles. Every section has suffered failures. The greenhouse is full of mutations, the power supply is dysregulated, the virtual reality has, oh boy, problems. Even the stasis beds, the one thing this endeavor was meant to protect, have been compromised. By the time Yi returns to the fight, there are less than 400 Solarians left alive and undamaged. The project has failed, and the last hope of Solarian civilization is on the brink of collapse. In the true ending, Yi decides to finally bring an end to the madness, to follow the way of Tao, and accept the end he has struggled against for so long. Before doing so, he returns the human captives to Earth, who will be the only testament to his people's existence. But there is another option. Alternatively, Yi can choose to save the Solarians. If he does, the ending returns him to their homeworld, where he carries on where the souls failed. He is now the only Solarian who is still awake. But it's not all bad. Humanity is there with him, and they are now part of the effort to salvage what is left of Yi's people. But this is the bad ending. Why? And make no mistake, that's not my interpretation. There's a musical score played during this section, and the only other time it's played is during the sacrificial ceremony, the first time you're reminded that Red Candle Games made their mark with horror. I don't see it that way. Not entirely. The worst part is the brains. In order to keep the virtual reality program running, human brains are required to expand the computing power. You need a good number, and they have to be replaced over time. I will be the man to come forward and say that harvesting brains is a bad thing, but it's not the only consideration. At certain points in the game, you acquire treasures, a nobleman's ring, a coin hidden in a charm, little things that you can recycle for extra money. And you probably should recycle them, as upgrades aren't cheap and there's no achievement for having them, and at least one for selling them. But I didn't. See, in the last 2 levels, you fight against mutated Solarians. Solarians who were put under and woke up to become something horrific. Some of them drop these. These are passenger tokens, tickets to New Kunlun, basically, and inscribed on them are the last words and thoughts of the passengers before they went into cryostasis. These are the words of people who didn't make it. An old man with a grudge. A little boy who hopes to cure his parents in space. A streamer, actually. I couldn't possibly have sold these things because they were all that was left. They were the last evidence that these people existed, and I could not be the one to erase that. Which is exactly what the true ending does. It erases them from existence and ensures the Solarians will be forgotten. It is the demise of a culture. The odds of Yi successfully turning this around are small. Curing the Tianhua is an astronomical task. Even if he does, there are problems with the VR system that must be rectified before anyone is woken up. But there are possibilities here too. For one, he now has a full staff of people immune to the Tianhua who are supporting him. For two, the job is smaller. With fewer Solarians in stasis, fewer resources are needed to keep things going. Yi has a real chance of saving these fascinating, amazing people, and I don't agree that throwing that chance away is automatically the best ending. And with that, let's leave spoiler territory behind. And make sure you take notes because there will be a test at the end of the game. Welcome back. So, I think I know what all of you are really here for. But there might be some of you who want to talk about combat, so let's do that instead. This game has single-handedly sold me on the concept of Sekiro, which I will acquire the second it goes on sale. That's way too much money. What I love so much about the combat in Nine Souls is how improvement can be measured. Each enemy has a unique attack pattern. At first, you're just trying to learn it, and during this phase, getting killed by rank-and-file enemies is a regular occurrence. Once you know their patterns though, you start figuring out when the safe pauses are and can make your strikes at those moments. Now these enemies are doable, a condition which shortly progresses to easy. Now you're not just defeating enemies, you're defeating enemies efficiently. And what helps you in that are your methods for damage avoidance. There is no shield, and no dedicated block button you can hold to catch your breath at the cost of posture damage. Dashing is the first one. Like most dashes, it's stuffed full of iframes and will pass through most attacks. You take no damage, but there's a short cooldown so it can't really be spammed. Also, dashing is a completely defensive measure that does not progress the fight. Now meet parry. You're all familiar with this, I'm sure. Time the parry right and damage is negated. Time it wrong and take full damage. But time it slightly wrong and you take internal damage. Internal damage is better, in complete defiance of all medical knowledge, because it will heal slowly over time. The sibling of parry is air parry. Just be in the air while parrying. There is an advantage to this as it's direction neutral. You can be facing away from an enemy when you air parry and it will still succeed. You also get a small bump in the air which has real mechanical value in boss fights and can sometimes be used for sneaky mobility. Last is the unbounded counter. Unlike parry, which requires you to press a button at the right time, countering requires you to charge the move then release at the right time. This is harder to do, but even otherwise unblockable red attacks can be rendered impotent by a successful unbounded counter. Not only that, but you'll inflict internal damage on your opponent, which can be converted to real damage with a charm. Right, that's the other thing. Each time you successfully parry an attack, you build chi. If you find an opening, you can place a charm on your opponent which can be detonated, doing damage proportionate to how much chi you've built up. And if you get good at parrying, you will build it up fast. Defense in Nine Souls is the foundation of offense, creating a very dynamic and fun system for rending enemies limb from limb and feeling like a master of the craft as you do. To explain how awesome and versatile this is, I'm going to spoil one boss for you. I'm sorry, but it can't be one of the early easy ones. Meet Lady Ethereal. She's best girl. She's just not at her best right now. The first round with Lady Ethereal is easy enough. Parry, slash, dash, charm, boom, repeat. It's not hard. Then phase 2 starts, and the good lady is joined by 2 shadow clones. These clones take no damage, but can do plenty of damage to you. They have to be dealt with in the same way as the first phase, but with 3 of them hitting you in sequence and only 1 being real. Phase 2 is about managing a fight that just tripled in difficulty, and one where you can't afford to ignore any of the enemies because any could be the real one. This is a frantic fight that demands precision to not only defend yourself from the clones' attacks, but to land at least 1 hit on each of them. As I got better at this fight and started getting into the flow state, it felt so familiar, like I had wandered into Mantis Lords 2.0. Weird that so many people consider this an unfair fight. I had a blast working my way up through it. It was long, sure, but in no way at all was this impossible. Now her third phase, that is impossible. Instead of fighting 3 clones, you're fighting 7. Not only that, but at random times, Lady Ethereal takes center stage and tosses a massive red ball of death at you, and this thing is so hard to avoid. Bosses in Nine Souls have a habit of doing this. They make you fight through a first and sometimes second phase, then drop a final phase on you like an anvil sent express airdrop by Bugs Bunny. It was very common for me to die from the first attack of a last phase. But they are not as impossible as they seem, and clues are often in the fight itself if you're keen-eyed enough to see them instead of spending hours mastering a strategy that, while ultimately successful, was horribly inefficient and wasted a ton of my time. In the case of the red ball, it's all about timing, and realizing that the clones are not attacking at random. Whenever Lady Ethereal prepares the strike, you're attacked from both sides. This is a gift, because if you parry each of them, you'll have the perfect timing to dodge through her red attack and take no damage at all. It kind of sucks that people have turned get good into an insult because it feels so amazing, that moment when you realize, holy shit, I'm good. Okay, so long story short, Nine Souls is amazing. It is not the second coming of Hollow Knight, and it is not the successor of Sekiro. It is Nine Souls. It draws inspiration from across the board, but forges something uniquely its own, and is my shiny new game. Thanks for playing, everyone. Just don't rage and break your monitor, okay?